August 23, 1847, the air in Albemarle County, Virginia, didn't just hang, it suffocated. In the upper chambers of Whitfield Manor, a scream, sharp, jagged and primal, tore through the sweltering afternoon heat. Catherine Whitfield was bringing a new heir into the world, a child meant to solidify a tobacco dynasty. But in that room, the atmosphere wasn't one of joy. It was one of ancient, simmering secrets. Standing over Catherine was Hannah, an enslaved midwife whose hands had pulled more than 200 lives into the light of the American South. Hannah knew things the master didn't. She knew the lineages written in blood and bone that the law refused to acknowledge. And 47 minutes after that baby took its first breath, Hannah leaned in. She didn't offer a blessing. She whispered a truth into Catherine's ear so toxic, so devastating, that it would do what no rebellion ever could. It would burn the Whitfield name to the ground from the inside out. This isn't just a story of birth. It is a story of how the most powerless women in history held the keys to their master's total destruction. The role of the enslaved midwife was a paradox of the highest order, existing at the intersection of total bondage and absolute necessity. While the law defined a woman like Hannah as mere property, the biological reality of the plantation made her the most essential figure within the manor's walls. She was the one invited into the most private chambers where white men were forbidden, standing as a silent witness to the raw, unpolished truth of the master's family. In the agonizing hours of labor, the rigid barriers of racial hierarchy often softened into a desperate reliance on her ancient, inherited knowledge. She held the lives of heirs and mothers in her hands, positioned in a place of intimacy that no overseer or master could ever truly penetrate. This proximity granted her a vantage point from which she could observe the hidden fractures and moral failures of the elite class. Hannah did not just deliver children. She archived the physical and genetic history of two families who believed their secrets were buried in the soil. Her expertise in midwifery, passed down through generations of West African tradition, allowed her to recognize biological markers that the white family remained willfully blind toward. While the masters focused on the ledger of tobacco profits and the expansion of their land, Hannah was tracking the quiet movements of the bloodline across the color line. She saw the children in the slave quarters who bore the master's nose, and she saw the white children in the nursery who bore the marks of forbidden affairs. Her memory was a living record of every transgression committed under the cover of night or behind the closed doors of the neighboring estates. To the Whitfields, she was a tool, but to the enslaved community, she was the guardian of a truth that could level the plantation. The power she held was not the kind found in a courtroom or a deed, but rather the leverage of a witness who could not be easily silenced. Because white society viewed enslaved people as intellectually inferior, they often spoke freely in front of her, assuming she lacked the capacity to connect the dots of their scandals. This arrogance was the fatal flaw of the plantation owners, as it allowed Hannah to compile a devastating map of the family's true genealogy. She understood the intricate web of paternity that linked the Whitfield and Blackburn estates long before any document could ever surface to prove it. Her silence was not a sign of ignorance, but a strategic accumulation of knowledge that she guarded until the moment it would be most impactful. In the birthing room, she was both a servant and a judge, waiting for the physical evidence of the master's sins to finally emerge. When the Whitfield heir was finally born with the 3-spot birthmark, it was the final piece of a puzzle Hannah had been holding for over 2 decades. At that moment, the power dynamic of the room shifted entirely. Even if the master pacing downstairs remained unaware of his own downfall. Hannah possessed the singular ability to name the father of the mother, a revelation that would strip the family of its carefully polished veneer of respectability. She was the only person alive who could bridge the gap between the 1823 affair and the 1847 birth, making her the architect of the family's impending social execution. Her whisper to Catherine was the release of 24 years of stored leverage, a moment where the property finally spoke back to the owner with a truth that was undeniable. This was the ultimate revenge of the enslaved woman, using the very intimacy she was forced into to dismantle the lives of her oppressors. Ultimately, the story of the silent witness reveals that the plantation system was never as secure as the masters believed it to be. Every time an enslaved woman was brought into the home to cook, to clean, or to deliver a child, the white family was inviting a spy into their most sacred spaces. Hannah represents a class of women who were the keepers of the South's most dangerous biological archives, holding secrets that could invalidate marriages and legacies. Though she lacked legal standing, her testimony was written in the physical traits of the children she caught in her linen cloths, a record that no law could erase. The tragedy of her sale in 1848 only proves how much the Whitfields feared the weight of her observations once they were brought into the light. Though she left the plantation in chains, but she left it in ruins, proving that the most potent weapon against a lie is the memory of those who were never meant to speak. The 3-spot birthmark served as a silent, biological ledger that documented the moral decay of the Whitfield lineage across generations. To the casual observer, the small triangle of dark spots on the infant's shoulder blade was merely a curious physical quirk of nature. However, to the sharp eyes of the midwife, it was a brand of paternity that defied the laws of man and the lies of the elite. This specific mark acted as a genetic fingerprint, a recurring motif that appeared with haunting consistency within the family's hidden history. It was the physical manifestation of Thomas Whitfield, Tuhu's unchecked shadow, a visual proof of his transgressions that finally bubbled to the surface. In a world where the written word was controlled by the powerful, this biological mark became an unalterable piece of evidence. For Hannah, the mark was a bridge across time that connected the events of 1823 to the crisis unfolding in the 1847 birthing room. She had first committed the pattern to memory decades earlier, while serving the patriarch, recognizing it as a unique trait of the Whitfield men. When she saw the exact same arrangement on the skin of an enslaved boy named Jacob, she understood the depth of the master's exploitation. The birthmark did not care for the boundaries of the law or the social distance between the main house and the slave quarters. It appeared with equal clarity on the child of a forced union and the child of a prominent marriage. This recurring symbol turned the bodies of the children into living testimonies of a secret that was never meant to be shared. The presence of the mark on the newborn son of Catherine and Thomas III transformed a moment of celebration into a scene of quiet horror. Hannah recognized that the infant was not merely carrying his father's features, but a legacy of incest that spanned 2 separate plantations. Because she had delivered Sarah on the Blackburn estate years prior, she knew the mother herself carried the same mark on her own shoulder blade. The triangle of spots was no longer just a family trait, it was a map of a bloodline that had folded back upon itself. While the white family saw a healthy heir, the midwife saw a biological catastrophe born of 2 decades of silence. The mark provided the objective truth that would eventually allow Catherine to confirm her own horrifying origins. This biological marker functioned as the ultimate subversion of the plantation's carefully constructed racial and social hierarchies. It proved that despite the master's efforts to sell away inconvenient children, the blood would always find a way to reveal the underlying truth. The 3 spots were a constant reminder that the actions of the past were never truly buried in the red clay of Virginia. Every time the mark appeared, it stripped away the masks of respectability worn by the tobacco gentry, exposing the predatory nature of their world. It was a secret written in the flesh, a language that required no literacy to read, but possessed the power to shatter an empire. The mark acted as a beacon for the truth, guiding Catherine through the darkness of her own investigation. By the time the public revelation occurred, the birthmark had become the focal point of a scandal that would haunt the region for years. It was the physical proof that Catherine used to silence the doubters and the doctors who claimed she was merely suffering from a fever. No amount of social standing or legal maneuvering could explain away the identical markings shared by a master, a slave, and a high-born lady. The mark proved that the biological reality of the South was far more complex and interconnected than the white elite dared to admit. Even after the families were ruined and the plantation was divided, the story of the 3 spots remained a local legend. It stood as a permanent scar on the history of Albemarle County, proving that the body remembers what the mind tries to forget. The web of incest began in the humid summer of 1823, a season that would eventually serve as the architect of the Whitfield family's total collapse. During this period, Thomas Whitfield, too, stayed at the Blackburn plantation under the guise of a business partnership, but his true focus was a clandestine affair with Martha Blackburn. The power dynamics of the era allowed a wealthy planter to move through the homes of his peers with a predatory freedom that went largely unchecked by social convention. Martha, trapped in a marriage of convenience and frequently left alone while her husband traveled, found herself entangled in a union that defied both law and morality. The resulting pregnancy was not a blessing, but a ticking clock that Martha desperately attempted to synchronize with her husband's return to avoid detection. She successfully manipulated the timeline of her daughter Sarah's birth, ensuring that the world saw a legitimate Blackburn heir instead of a Whitfield secret. The horror of this deception lay in the fact that it created a biological proximity that the rigid Southern social structure was never designed to handle. By raising Sarah, the future Catherine Whitfield, as a Blackburn, Martha effectively placed her own daughter on a collision course with her biological half-brother, Thomas Atherm. The 2 children grew up in the same elite circles, visiting the same ballrooms and tobacco estates, never suspecting that they shared a father and a genetic code. This willful ignorance on Martha's part was a survival mechanism, a desperate hope that the truth would remain buried beneath the layers of silk and social standing. She watched her daughter's courtship with Thomas Ather with a paralyzed silence, choosing to protect her reputation over the biological sanctity of her child's future. The marriage in 1844 was more than a union of wealth. It was a profound violation of the natural order that Martha allowed to proceed. Hannah's role as the midwife provided the missing link that finally bridged the gap between the 1823 affair and the 1847 tragedy. While the White families relied on paper records and social reputation, Hannah relied on the undeniable evidence of the physical body and the memories of the enslaved. She recalled the exact months of Thomas Tiku's visit and compared them to the birth of the enslaved boy Jacob, who shared the same father and the same mark. This triangulation of evidence allowed her to see the invisible threads connecting the main houses of 2 different counties, through a single man's lust. Hannah understood that the purity of the Virginia gentry was a carefully curated myth, sustained only by the silence of those they kept in bondage. Her knowledge turned the casual business visits of 1823 into the evidence of a crime that would eventually invalidate a high society marriage. The psychological fallout for Catherine, upon learning the reconstruction of this timeline, was a descent into a specific kind of madness fueled by horrified certainty. She was forced to re-examine every memory of her childhood and her marriage through the lens of a biological nightmare she had never requested. The realization that her mother had stood by and watched her marry her own brother transformed her grief into a cold, calculated rage against the entire system. She saw that the honor her father Henry Blackburn died defending was a hollow shell, protecting a lie that had been nurtured by her mother's cowardice. Every intimate moment she had shared with Thomas III was suddenly recast as an act of unintentional incest, a stain that could never be washed away. This clarity gave her the strength to compile the records and letters that would eventually serve as the evidence for her public and explosive revelation. In the end, the web of incest proved that the sexual exploitation inherent in the slave system would eventually consume the masters as thoroughly as the enslaved. The boundaries that white men crossed in the slave quarters inevitably led to the blurring of boundaries within their own parlors and dining rooms. Thomas Whitfield Sicker's inability to restrain his impulses created a genealogical trap that lay dormant for 24 years before snapping shut on his own son and daughter. The 1823 affair was not an isolated incident of infidelity, but a foundational crack in the structure of two of Virginia's most prominent families. When the truth finally emerged, it demonstrated that the secrets of the plantation were never truly contained by the fence lines or the laws of the state. The bloodline had its own memory, and it demanded a reckoning that no amount of wealth or social prestige could ever hope to pay. Catherine's psychological collapse was not a sudden break, but a slow and agonizing erosion of her entire reality following the midwife's whisper. The revelation transformed the familiar walls of Whitfield Manor into a prison of mirrors, where every portrait and family heirloom mocked her newfound knowledge. She spent her days in a state of hyper-vigilance, staring at her newborn son and searching his tiny features for the evidence of a biological crime. The exhaustion of recent childbirth merged with a cold, hollow dread that made the simplest interactions with her husband feel like a violation. She withdrew into a world of shadows, refusing the comforts of her station and the company of her social peers. Her mind became a courtroom where she was simultaneously the lead investigator, the primary witness, and the horrified victim of a secret. To confirm the truth, Catherine began a covert and systematic investigation into the family's private archives, operating with the precision of a woman with nothing left to lose. She waited for Thomas Guthrie to be occupied with the plantation's tobacco business before slipping into his study to scour old visiting records and personal correspondence. She tracked the movements of her late father-in-law Thomas II, mapping his 1823 travels against the quiet, unanxious letters her mother had written during that same period. Each document she unearthed served as a jagged piece of a puzzle that slowly formed a picture of systemic betrayal and hidden lust. She found mentions of joint ventures that never materialized and gaps in family chronicles that pointed directly to her mother's hidden pregnancy. This was not a search for hope, but a calculated hunt for the final proof of her own family's moral bankruptcy. The investigation soon moved beyond the main house and into the ledgers of human property, where the most damning evidence of all was carefully recorded. Catherine examined the plantation's slave birth records, noting the repetitive appearance of the three-spot birthmark among the children fathered by Thomas II in the quarters. She realized with a jolt of nausea that the man she called her husband was surrounded by half-siblings who worked his fields in chains. The realization that her own son was biologically linked to the enslaved man Jacob through multiple paths shattered her remaining faith in the Southern social order. She saw that the boundaries of race were merely a legal fiction used to mask a chaotic and interconnected web of shared blood. Her investigation was no longer just about her own marriage, but about the fundamental rot at the core of Virginia's elite society. By early autumn, the weight of her discoveries had manifested as a physical decline that the local physicians mistakenly diagnosed as a lingering puerperal fever. Catherine allowed them to believe she was physically ill, using the isolation of the sick room to further contemplate the explosive nature of her evidence. She wrote a final, direct letter to her mother, Martha, stripping away all social niceties and demanding a confession for the sake of her soul. The response she eventually received was the final blow, a written admission of the 1823 affair that turned her suspicions into an unchangeable historical fact. With this document in hand, Catherine's withdrawal transformed into a terrifying clarity of purpose that her husband mistook for the onset of recovery. She was no longer a victim of the secret. She had become the master of it, preparing to use it as a scorched earth weapon. The final stage of her collapse was marked by a total rejection of the Southern lady persona that had defined her entire life until that moment. She stopped caring about the preservation of the Whitfield name or the inheritance of the land that her son was supposedly destined to rule. The betrayal by her mother and the silent complicity of the plantation system had killed her sense of duty to her class and her kin. She began to see Hannah, the enslaved midwife, as her only true ally in a world built on the lies of white men and the silence of white women. This alliance of necessity between a mistress and her slave was the ultimate subversion of the hierarchy that Thomas de Sevres fought to maintain. Catherine was prepared to burn her world down, knowing that the truth was the only thing left that could possibly set her soul free. The baptismal celebration on November 14th was supposed to be the crowning moment for the Whitfield dynasty, but it became their public execution. As the elite of Albemarle County gathered in the opulent parlor, they expected a traditional display of wealth, piety, and the continuation of a proud Virginia line. Instead, Catherine stepped into the center of the room with a cold, terrifying composure that immediately silenced the whispers of the prominent guests. She did not present her son for a blessing, but rather as a piece of living evidence that would shatter the foundations of their social order. In a voice that cut through the humid air like a blade, she began to unravel the web of lies that had protected the family for decades. The parlor, once a symbol of refinement, suddenly felt like a trap as she laid out the biological truth of her own existence. The moment of peak horror arrived when Catherine reached for her child and exposed the three-spot birthmark to the stunned assembly of planters and ministers. She produced Martha Blackburn's written confession and the plantation ledgers she had painstakingly cross-referenced during her weeks of solitary investigation into the family's hidden past. To ensure the truth was undeniable, she summoned Hannah from the quarters to testify before the white elite, a radical act that violated every unspoken rule of their society. The guests watched in paralyzed silence as an enslaved woman's words were used to invalidate the marriage of two of the region's most powerful families. The revelation that the perfect Here was the product of an unintentional incestuous union, sent a shockwave through the room that no social grace could ever repair. The reaction of the assembly was a chaotic mixture of visceral disgust, frantic denial, and a desperate urge to flee the scene of such a monumental scandal. Thomas III exploded in a fit of rage and disbelief, while his mother Eleanor attempted to dismiss the entire scene as the fever dream of a madwoman. The Episcopal minister, frozen with the baptismal water still in his bowl, eventually refused to proceed, stating that the church could not bless a union born of such corruption. Prominent neighbors who had come to celebrate the Whitfield legacy now scrambled for their carriages, fearing that the stain of the revelation might somehow cling to their own reputations. Within an hour, the manor was emptied of its guests, leaving behind a family that was legally, socially, and morally decimated. The aftermath of that afternoon saw the swift and brutal destruction of the Blackburn and Whitfield names, as the story spread like wildfire through the Virginia countryside. Henry Blackburn, unable to withstand the public shaming and the loss of his daughter's legitimacy, died shortly after from a stroke that the community attributed to his broken spirit. Thomas II retreated into a haze of whiskey and isolation, his authority over his plantation and his enslaved workers permanently undermined by the exposure of his father's sins. Catherine was cast out and ostracized, but she used her remaining strength to contact Northern abolitionists, turning her personal tragedy into a political weapon against the slave system. The social structure that had once seemed invincible proved to be remarkably fragile once the truth was finally spoken aloud in a room full of witnesses. Hannah's fate served as a final, bitter reminder of the cruelty of the system she had so effectively dismantled with her knowledge and her courage. To punish her for her role in the revelation, Thomas II sold her to a slave trader bound for the Deep South, hoping to erase the living memory of his family's disgrace. As she was led away in chains, she left behind a plantation that was in ruins, its secrets exposed and its future stolen by the very truths she had guarded. Though she was silenced by the law, her legacy remained in the broken lives of the masters who had once believed they could own even the biological reality of their children. The story of Whitfield Manor became a cautionary tale of how the most powerless can eventually bring down the most powerful with nothing more than the truth.